So I would like to briefly introduce our guest today, and then we'll have a Q&A format. There are very few people in his generation who have served in public service with so many distinguished positions. And usually when you have many different distinguished positions in public service, your reputation actually goes down eventually. His reputation has gone up every time he's had a position. And that, I think, is attributable to his intelligence, his hard work, his focus, and his real commitment to doing public service. So Bob is somebody I've known for a while, and I really admire all the things he's done. And just to review his career briefly, he's from Illinois, went to Swarthmore College, graduated Phi Beta Kappa there, went to Harvard Law School, graduated magna cum laude there, and also graduated the Kennedy School. And then after a clerkship with Pat Wald in the District of Columbia, D.C. Circuit, he eventually wound up in the Reagan administration working for Jim Baker at the Treasury Department. And then as Secretary Baker moved to the State Department as Secretary of State, Bob moved with him, and then he moved back to the White House eventually at the end of the Reagan administration. Bob moved with him as well there. Bob also, later when he left government, he moved into the private sector, but came back and was called back into the Bush administration. And there he served as special trade representative, cabinet officer, and did a distinguished job in that position. He then was asked by President Bush to serve as Deputy Secretary of State, which he did, and then left government briefly, and then was called back and appointed as the 11th President of the World Bank, appointed by President Bush. He took that job on July 1 of 2007, and on July 1 of 2012 will have filled a 5-year term, and he has decided to leave the World Bank and do something not yet announced, but I'll be getting into that. And anyway, Bob has had a distinguished career, and we're very pleased to have somebody with such a wide perspective on the global economy and a whole variety of other things that go on in Washington. So let me ask you at the beginning, Bob, when you started your career, you graduated from law school and you graduated from the Kennedy School, did you expect to spend the bulk of your career in public service? Was that always your goal? Or did you ever expect that you would do something different?
Well, let me answer that indirectly by first saying thank you to you, David, for something that I'm sure everybody here shares, which is the connection for this is going to be my true love is history.
Okay.
But I didn't know how I could make a living at it.
Okay.
And that goes to my thanks to you because, as I'm sure everybody is aware, you've had your philanthropy in a number of different areas, but for somebody who cares a lot about American history and some of the things that you've brought, it's been extremely generous, and I'm one of the people that looks at this and say, boy, I'm really great that somebody takes the time and effort to do this. So history was my interconnection. I always enjoyed
you majored
reading
in history in college.
History and economics. And so my sense sort of growing up, my father came out of World War II in Korea, was that one of the things that you could give back to your country was in a form of public service. So it's maybe a little quaint now, but I thought public service was the highest calling if you were able to do that, and I knew I didn't have the base or anything for elective office. So I was trying to, in my own kind of stumbling way, to prepare myself with different background, history, economics, finance, law, different aspects. And the good fortune that I've had in my life is to have some very good bosses. So, I tried to work with people who I could learn from. And knowing enough about the American system, I suspected that you would need to have opportunities to be in government, but outside government. And at the time that I was doing this, so I graduated from college in the 70s and law school in 81, was that this was that we used to think the law profession, this is probably was an alternative, turned out not to be that way so much for me. But so the idea was really how to continue to learn and expand across these areas, and frankly, benefit from the experiences I've had with very good bosses.
Who was the most impressive of those bosses?
Now, this is tricky. Well, I obviously worked a long time with Secretary Baker, starting with him at Treasury at 85, and also being involved with him with the 88 campaign, which was my first exposure to elective politics. And I have enormous respect for him because not only was he able to bring together a skill of sort of substance and bureaucratic politics, we also knew something about elective politics. But I think the thing that was most important, and I didn't fully recognize this perhaps until later in my career, is that for Baker and the people that he had, it was kind of every day was kind of what can we do to get something done? And I mention that because it's sort of my inclination of life anyway, so it was natural. But I am sometimes surprised how many people, when they get into public service, it's more of they're kind of there to go through the inbox or have the seat. And at least for me, the purpose of those posts is to have an opportunity to make a difference.
So you've worked for 4 presidents: President Reagan, President Bush 41, President Bush 43, and you've served with President Obama, in effect.
And actually, I was back in the Ford administration.
Okay.
And this is a nasty little secret, but I took a leave of absence when I was at the law school working for Phil Hyman in your administration, the Carter administration, the criminal division.
You've obviously overcome that problem, but you don't put that on your resume. I can understand that, but
we were hunting down criminals. That was acceptable under any government.
So, of the presidents for whom you have worked or you have worked with, how would you compare their decision-making style?
Oh, now this is even getting trickier. Well, I think the main way I approach that is that any president, brings a different combination. And it's really the job of those working with the president to adapt to the president's style. And I saw this in most sharp relief, I guess. I was younger in the Reagan administration, but I was working at the Treasury Department in Reagan and sort of Bush 41. And so I think, one of the lessons I think that has to be learned is the combination of arts as an American system. The president is a head of state as well as a head of government. And so it's partly the communication, it's partly the symbolic role, and as sort of a student of government, I say this across administrations. I was just talking with President Clinton recently. He was, there's an art of being how he would combine those. But I do think that the key is this sense of some sense of direction, what you want to try to accomplish. For Reagan, that was at a different level and form than it was for Bush 41. And so for Bush 41, with the great international exposure and experience he had, I think the country and the world was very fortunate to have him there at the end of the Cold War. And things that at the time I know that I might have wished we might have been more aggressive at, I think in aftermath, he was proven to be correct. And what I'm talking about was, for example, when the Berlin Wall came down, there was a lot of commentary about how he should be exulting more. And he was very careful about that because he was playing for a longer term, and he was developing a relationship with Gorbachev, which ended up serving the United States and the world very well. So it was very, very different styles. But I guess the other part of it, because since this is a hot topic today, is I've been through this enough to know that there's periods in America where there's the idea that, well, our Constitution is dysfunctional and it won't work. I'm an adamant opponent of that. I saw that, in the late 70s and Reagan administration. And so I think, frankly, one of the challenges is how the executive branch works effectively with a Congress. You've got some former members here. And I've seen this from different angles, because when I came into Republican administrations, you had Democratic Congresses, and they had been in Congress a long time, and they expected to continue to be in Congress. And now I've seen this across different aspects. And the reason I'm giving this some thought is probably like people in this room, I'm thinking about things like fiscal cliff and kind of where the budget issues go. And I think part of the challenge for an effective executive is also having a strategy to work effectively with Congress.
Well, let me ask you, when the World Bank was set up after World War II, it was thought that it was necessary to help a lot of so-called developing countries. Now it's a long time after World War II. The developing countries have renamed themselves emerging markets, and many of them are actually doing much better economically than the so-called developed markets. Why do we still need a World Bank?
Well, just give me a moment on this, because taking this historical context, the way that I look at the bank today and in the past and in the future goes to that origin. I mean, people in this room may be aware that World War II is still going on, actually, when the bank was created in 1944. And it was created by a group of people that were thinking, how did the economic crises and consequences of the 20s and 30s lead to this disastrous world conflict? And so they developed the IMF to deal with issues of currency and exchange rates and balance of payments. The World Bank was really there first for reconstruction. The first loan and the largest loan to date in real terms was to France. Development was kind of a secondary issue because at that time many of today's developing countries were still colonies. And then you had what they actually created, something called the International Trade Organization, didn't pass the Senate. They relied on the GATT for the trade area, and then that eventually became the World Trade Organization. My point with that is, if the issues of trade, currency, development, reconstruction, exchange rates, those look pretty current to me in the newspapers. And so the question is, how do you modernize these institutions to meet for the different challenges? And the starting point for me is, we still live in a world of sovereign states. That's the key governmental bodies. But there's actually a very thin tissue of multilateral institutions that try to connect them to work together on common problems. So I think that those institutions, if anything, are more important than ever, but how they operate has to change. So the world of the World Bank, in circa 1950 was a bank where you had capital controls, limited restrictions. Now we're in a world of much greater private capital flows. And so part of my challenge and those others at the bank is, we've done some very interesting things with IFC, our private sector arm. We've done some things where on the knowledge side, we're increasingly, because of the success in developing countries, the lessons are coming from other developing countries to other developing countries. So the work we do in the Middle East and North Africa today draws off work that had occurred elsewhere in the world. So one of the ways that I sometimes describe the work at the bank is that our problem is we're called bank. And so most people at least used to think that banks were about putting money out. And what
sometimes getting it back.
Sometimes getting it back. But in a way, when the World Bank group is most effective, in a sense, what we do is we take sort of knowledge and learning and experience that has been developed over time, increasingly comes from other developing countries. We do have different financial instruments that we're trying to be innovative of using, so that distinguishes us from a university or think tank. But then, even though we're not insignificant relative to the size of the markets, it's still a drop in the bucket. So we try to look for things that can help develop markets, institutions' capacity. It may be carbon markets, it may be local currency bond markets, it may be microfinance markets. So part of the challenge is to see the institution as a cooperative problem solver. And so if somebody asked me today, what is the bank most about, I'd say about development solutions. And part of this involves political economy judgments as well as financial ones.
So you mentioned the structure of the World Bank, and it is often said that the World Bank is, some people say, bureaucratic. You may or may not agree with that. But the structure, as I understand it, is you have governors of the World Bank, but these people also, while they're your bosses, they're your governors, they also work for you. How do you do that when you're supposed to tell these people what to do, but they're also your bosses? How does that work?
Well, it's a little different, but let me start with your point about a bureaucracy. Of course it's a bureaucracy, but one of the challenges as a public sector executive is, how do you prevent a bureaucracy from just slipping into processes and committees and least common denominators? So having spent some time in the private sector as well as the public sector, I actually find that being a public sector executive sometimes is more challenging to be able to focus on results. But as for the governance structure, the governors are actually at the ministerial level. And those are the people that, when I have to really get things done, I have to really work in capitals. But we have a board of executive directors, 25 of them, and some represent countries and many represent groups of countries. They're an on-site board, and they have a staff, a total of about 300. And in many respects, this is kind of a leftover of the founding era before air travel, where you would have this group that's on site. And the best way that I can describe it is, when I tell, for example, my successor how to think about it, I said, I wouldn't get caught in the stereotype of board. It's really three things. It's a parliament, it's a multilateral diplomacy, and it's a board. And you have to recognize that if you're going to work with it. So, for example, because people are representing countries and constituencies, while we try to encourage a broader sense of fiduciary responsibility, they're, as they might be in NATO or the WTO, they're representing interests. And so the challenge is to try to take these different constituencies and focus them on mutual problem solving. And frankly, part of that is not only what you do at the board, it's what you do at capitals.
But if you were setting up the World Bank structure and de novo, and you could set it up, would you set it up this way?
Well, one difference that I would put in place is that we, over the years, it started out with the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And that was basically, we've got a AAA rating, we borrow very effectively. We, in fact, everybody else's turmoil in the markets helps us. Our borrowing costs are going down. And we do long-term loans and investments through the public sector. In the 50s, IFC was created, and IFC does investments in the private sector, and under Lars Stenell's leadership, working with him, we're doing more in the equity space. And then IDA was created in the 60s, which is for the 79 poorest countries. And that is money we have to continue to raise and recycle because it comes in grants or very long-term loans without credits. And then MIGA, which is a political risk insurance. It really should have a holding company structure. Okay, so instead the holding company is my office. And so that would be one structural change.
Now, you were appointed for a 5-year term by President Bush. You did an outstanding job by most people's accounts, by everybody's accounts, I believe. And I think you had a pretty good chance even to have a Democratic president reappoint you. Why did you choose not to seek reappointment?
Well, just one small point. While President Bush put me forward as the U.S. candidate,
that's right.
I had to be selected by
You're correct,
187 shareholders. And that will become important in these posts
will that
for the
change?
future.
Will the American president's recommendation, you think, for the next 20, 30 years still be the...
Which question you want answered first?
The hardest one, whatever the hardest one is.
No.
Okay, well, I'll go with the first.
They were both good. What was the one before?
Okay, well...
Let's see, what was it? It was the U.S. selection.
Well, no, the
why
president,
did I not,
the president
why did I
have,
not stay?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, basically, gee, I should have let that one go.
You wanted to get into private equity, or?
I think that space is taken, I'm told.
Right.
Yeah. To run these institutions effective, as I alluded to, at least my view is you have to both be anticipating, in our case, food, fuel, and financial crisis, others, and you have to be trying to innovate and trying to sort of help deal with real political problems and move fast and to become more flexible as a bureaucracy. My own sort of time frame, I've never been in a job longer than 5 years, so my own mental sort of thought was registered on 5 years. And frankly, I think while I've been pleased to make a difference in a number of areas, I think just personally, I sort of feel it's time to move on. I'm not sure what the next challenge will be, and then the other thing about this, and some people have a different view of this, is that I think it's good for institutions to have change. In other words, Dr. Kim, who will come in, he'll bring in some things that I didn't do. So obviously, I'd like to leave some things in place that will continue, but I think change is good and healthy, although sometimes not always so easy.
Were you surprised that, well, to finish the second question, how much longer do you think the American president can still make a recommendation to the World Bank governors and have it be followed?
Well, as a practical matter, remember, these are done through votes, and the United States has about a little over 15% of the votes for the World Bank and the IMF. So as long as the U.S. and Europe have the deciding number of votes, this has been sort of the understanding of them. Now, obviously, this has been criticized in many quarters, but let me give you a slightly contrarian view. And this comes from my experience both in the U.S. government but internationally. I think it's a good thing for the United States to have a role, including a leadership role, in multilateral institutions. And if you ask yourself, has there ever been an American head of the IMF? Has there ever been an American head of the WTO? Has there ever been an American head of the UN Security Council? UN Secretary General? Has there ever been an American head of any of the regional development banks? You're going to come up with a big fat goose egg. So frankly, it's not so critical that it is the bank, but I do think that for the United States and the world system as a whole, it's good to have Americans in some of these positions. And frankly, I spend time with the Congress, and this actually helps people have a sense of why these institutions and multilateralism are important. So if you go back to my opening logic of, lessons from the World War II and multilateralism and how to build cooperative institutions and structures, I think it's good for the United States to play a role in these institutions and good to have a sense of responsibility.
And were you surprised that Dr. Kim, who didn't have any background in finance, was selected for this position, or were you not surprised, and did you have any heads up that it was happening?
Well, I've worked closely with Tom Donilon in the White House, Tim Geithner, so I had some sense of the process, but I also, being around Washington for a while, learned when people ask me a question, I answer the question. I don't offer free advice on things.
Okay.
And it was their judgment, their call. And yes, it did surprise me because I don't think most people were aware of that Dr. Kim was sort of the candidates that were in the consideration. But I've had a chance to talk to him and know him, and he's clearly highly intelligent, highly accomplished. And I think one of the areas where actually there's an overlap is he's a scientist as well as a doctor. And going back to some of the transformation of the bank, I've been trying to emphasize sort of greater evidence and data-driven sort of work, results-based transparency, accountability, and this very much fits kind of with his sort of mindset. So there will be areas, on the pure finance side or some of the diplomatic side that may be newer to him. My sense is that he'll come to that pretty quickly. There's things that he will know that I will never know.
What was the best advice you got from some of your predecessors, and what's the most important advice you could give or did give to Dr. Kim?
Well, going back a little bit to your first question, I've been sort of a student of institutions, U.S. and globally, and so I've had the good fortune of actually knowing all the World Bank presidents going back to with Robert McNamara. And actually there's a wonderful book, if anybody's interested in this, it's a couple years old now, but Sebastian Mallaby did a book about Jim Wolfenson's tenure called The World's Banker, and it's a very good sense of some of the challenges of the institution. So I think I had a sense of kind of where they were putting the focus for their era. But this is part of the challenge of change. What might be a good focus in one point may not be the right one at a different point. And indeed, you want to try to build on some of the things that your predecessor did. So, Jim Wolfenson did a lot to open up the bank, and he opened the bank, which is was a group of, in a sense, economists who kind of were unused to sort of the nasty or sort of rambunctious world of civil society groups and NGOs, and that was very important for the bank. He did some very important decentralization of aspects of the bank. But given that, I think there were some things that then needed to be kind of readjusted at periods. And so I suspect and hope that Dr. Kim will build on some of the things I've done.
For the global economy right now, what is your biggest concern? Where do you think the most attention to the U.S. government should be spent, and what worries you the most about where the global economy is going?
The Eurozone. This, going back to one of the other, I'll come back to the Eurozone, but just to give you a sense of how the world has changed. In the past 5 years, 2/3 of global growth has come from developing countries. So part of the change of the nature of the World Bank is that what used to be seen as a case of charity or good-heartedness is now fundamental mutual interest and national interest, because that's where the growth is coming from. A lot of opportunities are coming from. And frankly, when I explain this to the U.S. Congress, it's partly, are you interested in Afghanistan? We're probably one of the most effective players in terms of the economic transition in Afghanistan. Are you interested in South Sudan? Are you interested in Indonesia? Do you think Mexico is important? So it's definitely a case of what I think is a changed mutuality of interest. And increasingly, as I've alluded to, let me give you a practical example, and again, it shows building on experience. Many people here will remember the financial crises in Latin America and East Asia in the 90s. There was a big macroeconomic response led by the IMF. The harsh lesson was that in many countries, macroeconomics wasn't enough, because if your nutrition programs weren't funded, if your kids couldn't go to school, you literally lose a generation. I mean, there's a clearly early childhood point where if kids don't get the proper nutrition, it affects their health and growth and education and productivity. So the good story of this is that Mexico was the first, but then Brazil, and we've now expanded these to 40 other countries, of these conditional cash transfer programs, where you give money that goes basically to the 15-20% bottom of the population under the condition that they send their children to school and they get health checkups. Probably done more for health of women in Mexico than anything in the history of the country. they do this for half of 1% of GDP. So as I kind of think about U.S. budgetary issues, I'm a fiscal conservative, but I certainly believe in investing in human capital at the bottom. So these are some of the changes that, again, this doesn't come out of the U.S. or Europe. This is an experience to now share with others. So to come back to the Eurozone, I think I have to be a little careful here, but
don't be too careful, because but, would you be happier or sadder if Greece got out of the euro? Just, I guess you're not going to answer that.
I'm a happy guy every day.
All right. You think Greece might get out of the euro?
No, but here's what I'm concerned about, is that, look, the true answer for that, and this goes to the core question, those are political economy questions that only the Greeks can answer and their European colleagues. It's not simply an economic issue. But having said that, I think the core question will actually not be Greece, it's Spain and Italy. And the Spanish and Italian governments are undertaking some very difficult fiscal reforms. They're undertaking structural reforms, which are key to future growth, but they take time. And so I think the danger for Greece, and what I'm worried about, is that if Greece does leave, frankly, there's going to have to be a lot of care taken in how that's done, and the ripple effects, and a little bit is, Mark Twain once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And so in this case, as I think about 2008 and Lehman,
right.
I'm not trying to draw a direct analogy, but I am saying where the danger comes in is when events come and they start to affect confidence and you get illiquidity moments, and then illiquidity moments start to lead something else to tumble, whether a bank or a company or something like that. And so I've been sort of pushing a little bit more on what you need to do to position yourself to get ahead of this, and then how to be ready for it. So let me be more specific in the Eurozone. One, I was one of the first people that was calling for some additional capitalization for the European Investment Bank, get more money from the European Commission's structural and cohesion funds, which are over 80 billion euro, because while the Germans are not going to have a great support of consumption, you could match some of this investment funds to help with the politics of reform in Spain and Italy, as well as some investment demand. Having said that, I don't think it's enough, and I think the key issue they're going to have to come to terms with is if you have medium-term reforms, which Spain and Italy has, you're going to need some medium-term assurance for investors. And there are different forms of that. I and some others said you could use the Hamiltonian approach. So I don't favor Eurobonds for all time, because I think you lose the fiscal discipline on the states. But if states are making reforms, you could do Eurobonds one time, as Hamilton did with the states after the Revolutionary War, assumption of the debt. Or a German policy think tank said you could use Eurobonds up to 60% of the GDP. Or, frankly, what I think is more likely to happen is you could start to use the European Monetary, or it was the EFSF, I'm just forgetting the name, the fund, European Stability Mechanism, ESM. And frankly, if they buy and stand back for some of the debt, well, frankly, their bonds are going to be a form of Eurobonds. Okay? But my main point is those are for Europeans to decide, but I think they're going to need a funding match with the reform match, and so far that isn't there.
Well, let's suppose when you leave the World Bank, somebody came to you and said, here's $1 billion to invest. You know everything about the world economy. Which 2 or 3 emerging markets would you invest that $1 billion in?
I'd go to the Carlyle Group.
Right. Well, you could do worse than that. But I mean, from your perception of the emerging markets, which ones are most attractive to you as a place where you really think that they have their act together, they're growing, they have inflation under control? Are you worried about China, for example, in terms of its inflationary aspects?
There are opportunities across all of these markets. I mean, you're a much more proven investor than I am, but just to give you an example, our returns on equity in sub-Saharan Africa at IFC have been, I think, 23, 24%. Our returns overall are 18%. Okay, so the point of this is, sub-Saharan Africa grew 5 or 6% a year for a decade before the crisis, and is now sort of back up. And I use sub-Saharan Africa not saying that it would be my ultimate investment choice, but I'm saying we're moving to a world of multiple poles of growth. okay? And people pay attention to China, or they pay attention to India, and they should. But what they also should recognize is there's lots of other individual opportunities in markets where people are doing reforms. So, you know, I don't know how many people know about Rwanda, but the government of Rwanda doing some very interesting things, and there's probably going to be some interesting business opportunities. Just again, as a market test, IFC supports about 180 private equity funds, as you know, around the world. And so we're trying to help build this as a market, as a vehicle for intermediation, not only for financing, but to help with these businesses. So my basic point is, I think the bright news is there's lots of opportunities in emerging markets, but as you know, there's risks. And there's risks you have to manage not only on the financial side, but on the policy and regulatory side.
So if President Obama were not to be reelected and Governor Romney were to be elected, it's been rumored that you might be a candidate to be Secretary of Treasury or Secretary of State, and I won't ask you which you prefer, if either, but if Governor Romney were to call you during the campaign or after he was elected, if he's elected, and said, I'd like you to give me advice about what I can do in the United States financial situation, what would you tell him to do? What would you tell him to do in terms of reducing the deficit, reducing the debt, reducing entitlements, increasing taxes? Do you have any prescription that you would give him that you're willing to share?
Well, after that very nice opening biography, where obviously I learned how to survive in Washington for 25 or 30
You're not
years.
going to answer that question.
No, but the way you phrased
forget
it,
the premise and just say, what would
the way
you?
you phrased it, the way you phrased it makes it very tempting, because I'll share an anecdote, and that is the new foreign minister of Australia was in Washington the past couple weeks, Bob Carr. He was a very successful premier of New South Wales. Many people here might know him. He's very pro-American, loves history. And I asked him, Bob, what's your main message? And he said that the United States is one budget deal away from restoring its global preeminence. And then he said, but also, I have to point out that in my region of the world, in the Asia Pacific, there are voices that are saying, the United States isn't up to this. You better listen to us. So that would be the focus of my advice, and I would say
to get a budget deal.
Well, and obviously I have preferences for the structure of it, but I guess let me back up a little bit and say probably like a number of people, I think that Erskine Bowles and Senator Simpson did a very good service. Now, whether I would have agreed with every jot and tittle of that's another question. I did say, for example, I asked, Paul Ryan, who's been a very active promoter, why didn't he sign on it? And it was interesting. I thought his answer was a very principled one. He said, look, I was most concerned about the Medicare program, because I felt that even with the changes they made, it wasn't sustainable. So he wanted to be committed to a premium support model. So people in this room are pretty understand, how many defined benefit plans are around in the world. Are you switching to defined contributions? And so that suggests to me that, some key players here, if they so choose, there's a broad-based interest in a broad-based tax reform like I was, on the periphery of in the mid-1980s. Everybody knows the variables for Social Security now. So what I think the key will be, the next president, whoever it is, I hope will face up to this issue, because I can say, as an American, but who's in an international organization, who spends a lot of time around the world, this is the number one indicator of whether the United States will be a strong, innovative, productive country. Now, the one other dimension, and that is, we were talking about Singapore, and the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore is the Finance Minister, Tharman, is also the chair of the IMFC committee, that's the IMF committee. And he made a very good argument, which is he's saying, part of the challenge now is not to just do fiscal consolidation, but to do so in a way that sort of creates the right microeconomic incentives. And in my view, that's how do you bring private capital in. So just to give you, again, a little example from the bank, I cannot go to a developing country now that isn't interested in public-private partnerships for infrastructure. And for a lot of the middle-income countries, it's not driven by finance. It's driven by the fact that they think they'll have better projects, they'll be better maintained, they'll be better operated. And I was just struck, as some of you might, you had a little debate in the newspaper, the Washington Post, over the past week, because Senator Bingaman was basically saying, look, we don't want to finance, private sector involvement in infrastructure. And Mitch Daniels, who led the effort to take this approach in Indiana, did a sort of a counterpiece. I find it interesting that in China, in Vietnam, in countries that are at least called communists, we have no problem monetizing assets at the state level. But in the state of Pennsylvania, they couldn't get it done. So there's some lessons here about innovation. Or in education. I find the debate in the U.S. to be kind of stultified. In developing countries, everybody's quite clear is that you need to have results, you need to sort of check the investment. Of course you have to measure results. Why else would you, how else you know what you're going to do? So the point that is that I think in addition to kind of dealing with the fundamentals of our fiscal plan, just as I've talked about structural reform in Europe and frankly middle-income countries trying to get structural reforms for productivity, the United States also needs to look at those issues. So in that sense, I think there's a great opportunity for the next president.
So you've now met heads of state from all over the world, finance ministers and so forth, foreign ministers. Who are the 2 or 3 most impressive people you've met outside the United States who in these capacities? Or some people you say are so talented and so impressive that you just have great memories of them, or you?
Well, it reflects the circumstances, and part of this, I got to meet Deng Xiaoping in 1989, and there was a feeling where you had I don't know if it's because he's already a figure of history, but let me connect it to maybe an idea. I was the point person in the U.S. on German unification, negotiating the 2+4 agreement. So I worked closely with the Germans and Chancellor Kohl.
And you speak German?
Ein bisschen. A little bit.
Okay, all right.
But one of the things that I was struck by about Chancellor Kohl was he had a phrase that I've often referred to, which is that it actually was a quote of Bismarck, is that the sign of a statesman is somebody who recognizes fate as she rushes past and grabs onto her cloak. And I like that because it's partly saying that you don't control events, okay? You have to, things happen, okay? And so you have to keep your eyes open for these fateful moments, but then you also have to move quickly. And in Helmut Kohl's case, frankly, when he grabbed on, given his weight, he could really shift fate in a significant way. But so when I think about events in Europe now, and again, I've got great respect for Chancellor Merkel, but some of the things we talked about, this is at a key point here, and it's going to take a little bit more than tactical maneuvering to face it. And so, there's other people who I admire for certain. Gorbachev was, obviously in Russia, the Soviet Union is not seen as a raving success. But when I think of some of the moral courage he did, because there were pressures to use violence and things like that, so I wouldn't say that that's a successful model of governance, but, as an individual, you take things away. But also in some of the poor countries, when I've seen, these are names that people would not necessarily be, front and center on their screen, but people who take courageous decisions to act, to kind of mobilize public support, particularly if it's a democratic system, and try to make their country and the system better.
Now, in your time in Washington, which was a very distinguished career, and it's not over, I believe, what would you say you're most proud of having done, either at the World Bank or in other parts of your career? What is the thing you regard as your greatest accomplishment? And what would you say is your greatest frustration or failure?
Well, as you've alluded to, David, I've been very fortunate. I mean, it's a serendipity of life. I had multiple challenges and opportunities. Because of my feelings about history, I have a great respect for the course that America led throughout the Cold War with its, ups and downs. And so I feel a particular privilege to have sort of been in the last rank of people kind of carrying forward that obligation at the end of the Cold War. And part of that obviously was German unification and sort of the uniting of Europe. And so, I was one of the bit players, but I was able to participate in that. When you start to get the individual level, I care a lot about trade. I think trade and openness are a very important part of economies and societies and microeconomic reform. So I kind of like to move into situations and then see if I can drive them forward. So when I became, trade representative in 2001, we took an agenda that, was a little bit stuck, and we kind of moved forward a whole series of free trade agreements, and they're finally still passing some of the last ones that I was doing. And then at the bank, in a different respect, I had a little bit of a turnaround challenge, and so I made a judgment that, frankly, the people who had come to the bank were there for a committed reason to the mission, and the sooner we got people focused on the mission, the better off it would be. We'd get back away from some of the water cooler gossip or knife stabbing or whatever it was, and then frankly, the way that we were able to respond pretty quickly and flexibly in this financial crisis to help developing countries, not only help them, but frankly has helped the standing of the bank.
Right.
And so each job has its own
And frustrations or failures?
Well, my major frustration now is the one that I alluded to, which is that, and this shows the changed nature of the bank. You probably wouldn't have expected World Bank presidents to be focusing as much on events in Europe. I mean, frankly, we helped organize a response to keep credit in Central and Eastern Europe in 2008. But I'm concerned about these effects, and I suppose the other disappointments was losing elections is probably not my favorite task.
So what do you do? I mean, when you have the job you have, the sun never sets on problems you have to deal with, so you're always working on something. But what do you do for relaxation? And you ever a way when you can take a day off and there's not a world crisis you have to deal with?
I've been a runner for many years, and so that's my prime source of relaxation, but that does have a problem because I've been struggling with a couple injuries, and when you're an injured runner, you get the double problem. You can't run, but you also don't get the relief, so that's, and then the other thing goes back to your very first question. I read a lot of history.
Well, try virtuous running. Just think about running, and that's what I try to do. I try to run a mile once a year, cumulatively. So we have some time for a few questions from members. Yes. Was that a question, or that was, no, you're not a question. Any questions? Yes, right here. Mike, a couple questions.
Hi, how would you
Could you give your name and who you're with?
Steve Vito, and I'm the guest of Information Management Consultants. How would you grade the U.S. government's response to the economic crisis in 2008 overall?
Only 2008? Okay, makes it easier. Well, I think that we're on the brink of a serious collapse of the financial system, and people can criticize steps along the way, but I think people avoided that, so I think that was pretty good.
Okay, another question? Yes, right here. Ambassador? One second. Here's the ambassador from Switzerland has a question relating to Switzerland, no doubt.
Okay. No, actually, it's broader than that. In Ambassador, any IFI investments and activities are determined on the basis of economic need, as well as sometimes on political, based on political considerations. I said as a former ED at the EBRD in London. So how did you, both in terms of geographic remit, also in terms of financial instruments, how did you experience this dichotomy of political considerations and actual need?
If we're doing the work of economic development effectively, we're not going to run into any sort of political difficulties. I guess maybe two thoughts on this. One of the things I've tried to encourage at the World Bank is to recognize we operate in a world of political economy. I think the economics profession started to go on the wrong path when they abandoned political economy to pure economy and then econometrics. And the point of this is that at the World Bank, for example, we've got some very talented, knowledgeable people, but what I've tried to say to them is our job is to help countries solve problems. So you need to understand the institutions and constraints. And so if the best textbook solution doesn't work, you haven't really solved the problem. So now we have to be careful because we're not a political organization. But do issues of governance, do issues of social accountability, do issues of inclusive growth, do issues of transparency affect? Of course they do. And so part of the challenge for me as an executive of the team is recognizing we have 188 members of different political systems. How do you advance that agenda? And with some that are more willing to take it on, I think you can make models of success. This is one of the issues going on in North Africa right now. That's why I think Tunisia is so important, not only because it's not a big size, but I think its success may show others a pathway, just as in the history of East Asia, you saw countries look at models along the way. And this actually requires some managerial issues at the bank, because if you're not really trained to do those issues, you can see why people would shrink away from them. So it's a question of of risk management, and it's a question of knowing when to go get help. And so this is partly the sort of the challenge of thinking about the institution in a broader capacity. The other part that your question at least invokes, it's kind of an inside aspect, is the bank is a cooperative. And so therefore there are assumptions that lending will be somewhat balanced around the world in different resources. And one of the things that I've tried to do is respect that, while at the same time having the flexibility to act more quickly in certain areas that would have greater significance. And just to give you a very practical financial aspect, we got the first recapitalization of the World Bank in 22 years. It gives us a stronger position. Our equity to loan ratio is 28%. But as I think about the things I've talked about with David about trying to think about what's going on in Europe, I have to think about how could I stretch that capital, okay? Well, one of the things is that, frankly, if we had a little bit more flexibility with our pricing and our maturities, I could be able to stretch that more, okay? So those are some of the issues that, as a multilateral, it's a little different than a pure financial company. But, the other thing is, I also like ways, particularly through the private sector, one of the things that I was most pleased we were able to do is create this asset management company, which is a subsidiary of IFC. If you think about it, how many international multilateral institutions that have subsidiaries? And we use this to channel sovereign funds and pension funds money into, because of our equity investment record, into emerging markets. And because our job really is more to expand those markets. So the more that then others will decide to invest on their own, the Carlyles and others, so much the better. So there are ways you can push the flexibility, but it really goes to some of the questions that David was asking, is that the challenge in a public institution, and you work in a government, but Swiss government probably works more effectively than most, is that it's easy that the internal trade-offs and the internal committees and processes and procedures can bog you down. And so going back to even the people that I've mentioned across history, I think part of the challenge of a public executive or a leader is you can't ignore those, whether it's your institution or elected democracy, but how do you work with them to keep pushing and leading towards doing things?
Are you worried about, or are you dreading or looking forward to not having security and all these kinds of things? You won't probably be as needing of security in the future, but you won't have the security. And how do you think about that? You're going to be taking the shuttle and just going through the metal detectors like everybody else, or that's not a worry?
Well, I am signing up for that frequent traveler program.
Okay.
Get through
All right. One more question right here. Okay.
Bob, Dave McCurdy from American Gas Association. I was going to ask you from your previous
Boy, that's a
position-
booming business, huh?
It's good timing, Bob. And you can talk about the assessment of energy in the World Bank, but actually back in your State Department role, you did an assessment of China and had some recommendations during transition. And would you give us a quick assessment, personal assessment of the political trajectory of China?
Well, one of the things that Dave's referring to is the bank did a project called China 2030, and there's an interesting little history of this because this goes back to predecessors at the bank. The bank has had a very good brand in China going back to Robert McNamara opening relations in 1980 against the U.S. Wishes and the board, I might add, and working closely with Deng Xiaoping. And over the past 30 years, it turns out that there have been moments where, as the Chinese reassess kind of where they're going, some bank teams have played a key role in that. And there's among the Chinese economic thinkers, there's a 3-day seminar down the Yangtze River that was very influential. And so I mention this because as we approach the 30th anniversary of the bank's relations, some of the Chinese came to me and said, look, one of the issues we're discussing in China is how to avoid the middle income trap. And this is a broader issue. So you get to a certain level of growth, and how do you maintain that? And so they suggested that I suggest to their leadership an effort to bring together, international talent to look at this. And the person who picked it up in particular was Li Keqiang, the man who's likely to be the next premier, but it was blessed by President Hu and Xi Jinping and others. And we were asked to work with the China Reform Commission, and this was under the State Council. It's a major think tank. And we really sort of took as our mandate the fact that China itself has said in the 12th five-year plan it wants to move towards greater consumption and greater domestic demand. But what does that mean in everything from the role of state-owned enterprises to land and labor and fiscal reforms and environment? And so we produced a rather extensive report that I respect the Chinese, country growing 10% a year for 30 years, that at least steps back and says, look, we suspect that this model won't keep working for the future. How do we need to change it? And again, to reference that, maybe Europe and the United States should think a little bit more in some of these terms as well. So I'm doing a little advertisement here because much of the world focuses on the fiscal, monetary, and spending issues, and I'm a big believer in the microeconomic agenda as well. But so this report, my best sense is part of some momentum that will build, and after the 18th Party Congress, this will partly depend on the composition of the standing committee. You got Jeff Bader here, knows more about it than I would. But my guess would be China is not a place that does big bang reforms. But I could see that you will start to have more pilots, sort of more provinces pushing and experimenting with things. And what I would look for is, Governor Zhou, the head of the central bank, pointed this out to me, is that it turns out that about every 10 years China does its own sort of policy political look at the economic process. That would next be due by the end of 2013. So by the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress, the third meeting late in the year, at least there's a possibility that the leadership will have consolidated position enough to push on those topics. Now, you referenced the politics, and here I should reference more with Jeff, but I would say that part of the reason why this will still be incremental is that you've got some factions here, and the factions have clearly been somewhat disrupted by Bo Xilai's demise. And I wouldn't be wise enough to know for sure how all that's going to balance out. I will say they will create some balance in it. But my rough take is that having known Xi Jinping since he came to the United States in 2006 and having seen him in Hangzhou and in Beijing and also Li Keqiang, is that I think there's at least a reasonable chance that these leaders will push more on some of these issues than you've seen in some of the recent years. But the larger story is this issue of the middle income trap is one that you're going to hear about more and more. And just to share with you a reference point that I talked about at lunch, as we did this China study, somebody went back and looked at 1960 and the number of countries or economies that the World Bank had determined were middle income, and there were 101. And by 2008, so almost half a century later, only 13 had made it to high income, and one of those was Greece. Okay? And so this is the issue really of that I feel in a lot of middle income countries is that what are the structural reforms for them to maintain sort of productivity and growth. But with each one of these, and by the way, the same with if China makes some of the reforms that are outlined here, it's going to provide opportunities for service sector, cross-investment. They're going to need to move up the value-added chain. This might have opportunities with intellectual property. So each of these internal changes creates opportunities in the external relationship, including for the United States.
Do you see any chance the World Bank headquarters will ever be moved out of Washington?
Well, under the charter, it is located in the place of the larger shareholder. So if the Europeans come together in unity out of this crisis and they all have one chair instead of the 8 or so chairs they have now, then I suppose I could move to Paris and I'd miss my opportunity.
That would kill the real estate market in downtown D.C., but okay. Bob,
I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. So.
Bob, I want to thank you very much for giving a great comprehensive view of the world, and thank you. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.